Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So in this video, I'm going to be making an opening system recommendation. So I was inspired to make this after reading the book Winning Chess Openings by Yasser Seirawan published in 1998. And essentially in the last 20 pages of that book, there are some system openings that are recommended. So if you don't want to enter a lot of theory, then you can just play that. And essentially, I'm going to be trying to do the same thing, but with modern analysis, and there is actually a lot more theory than I would have hoped, but I think that it's necessary. And essentially, this repertoire is going to be, I'm going to talk about what it's based on, but I think that this is more of a improviser's repertoire. So the moment your opponent plays a different first move or chooses a different structure, I think that it doesn't hurt. Rather, it will benefit you to improvise and see what the position demands. Essentially, this system repertoire is going to be based on knight f3, and then playing g3, bishop g2, and then castles. So we built our little house here with these being the first four moves. And there are some exceptions where we play d4, but most of the time we play for d3 and then playing e4. And the purpose of a system opening is that we avoid a lot of opening theory. For example, if we play the first move e4, then we need to know what we do against the Sicilian, Caracan, Ruy Lopez. I mean, if we play the Spanish game, then we need to know what to do against it. So this system is just basically a way to avoid all of that theory and just get a playable position into the middle game. The downside is that this is not the most challenging setup for black to face, and so more often than not, black will equalize quite easily if they know how to play against it. But I think that the position is still playable for white, so there shouldn't be any problems. And essentially, you can play this without much risk. The goal of this system opening opening system is to try to reduce the amount of work that you have to do on the opening, so you can focus on middle game strategies and like the end game. But I do have to warn you that if you're an improving player that wants to really be serious about chess, then this repertoire cannot be your main weapon. You should use this. You can use this possibly as like your secondary weapon, something to have in your back pocket. But it shouldn't be your main weapon, I think, because there are quite a few lines that provide black with like equal chances and even more space in the center, for example. So I recommend this for players that are under 2000, at least online rated. And if you're maybe higher rated than that, then you can possibly use this as like a side opening in faster time controls. So essentially the structural foundation of this repertoire is that we're going to go for a double Fianchetto setup if allowed. So we obviously, our first four moves are going to be knight f3, g3, bishop g2, and castles. And then eventually we can play d3, play b3, even play bishop e2, and then eventually push for e4. And in the early parts of the game, if black doesn't do anything to stop us from playing e4, then I think that we can definitely play e4 and the position is going to be good. But as I said before, this is going to be more of an improviser's repertoire, meaning that if given the chance to put the pawn on d4, it exits a lot of theory, like mainline theory, then I do recommend looking into that. And so it does help to have knowledge on the d4 openings if we go into the system. Essentially we play for e4 here, and we have two like bishops on these diagonals. And we can eventually like try to go for f4 and these type of ideas. So let's just get right into the theory. So after knight f3, we're just going to play g3, bishop g2, and short castles. And here there are a bunch of first moves that black can play. Okay, let's say that they, not b5, but let's just say that they go b6 here. Then I think in our best interest, we should just like transpose into the Owen's defense playing e4. And I think white has a very decent advantage here. I especially like this line after e6, d4, bishop b4, and knight d2. I think with bishop d3, knight f6, and then knight d2. I do like this system with some ideas of knight b1 c3. So obviously against the Owen's defense with 1b6, you can research your own weapon and what to do against it. Yeah, we know that b6 is not like the most challenging move against one knight f3. So yeah, you can just play your own stuff against b6, and against like a lot of like moves like d6 and stuff like that, you can just continue playing g3, bishop g2, castles. And in the d6 setups, you can even consider playing a move like d4, because you say that yeah, now you're exiting the system completely, and you just have a pawn in the center, and it should be a good slight advantage, obviously. But let's look into the more of the forcing variations. So 1c5, black signals that they want to that they're ready to enter the open, or enter the Sicilian after e4. But there's also an additional idea to play like d5, or even like go for an early Fianchetto with b6. So in this, with 1c5, we're going to continue with g3. And if they go for b6, then they're clearly going to go for bishop b7 next. We just play bishop g2, bishop b7, castles, and then g6. So as I mentioned before, this recommendation, opening system recommendation, is going to be based on like the W Fianchetto system. So black does the same thing actually. They try to go for g6 now. And seeing now that we cannot execute our plan with b3 here because bishop g7 would come with tempo, we just play d3 here, and we will try to go for e4. For example, if they try to prevent us from playing e4 with d5 here, we can just play e4 directly. And this is a very strong pawn sacrifice after takes and trading the queens. If they take on e4, we play knight c3 here, and white gets a lot of development for the pawn. For example, if they take another pawn, this is just straight up losing because we get a tempo on the bishop, and then we play knight h4, and the rook just drops in the corner. And instead, if they play bishop c6, then we have a very nice move, knight e5. After bishop takes g2, we don't take back immediately, but we play the move knight b5, threatening checkmate in 1, and they have only one way to stop this, which is knight a6, preventing knight c7. But after king g2, let's say bishop g7, we play knight c6 here, and the a7 pawn is going to fall. And if once the a7 pawn falls, this entire queenside structure is also going to be very, very weak. We have ideas of like a4, a5 to undermine it further. And so after e6, knight c takes a7, knight e7, we play a4 here, threatening a5 to break up this structure. And after castles, knowing that black might be playing a knight b4 very soon, we play the move c3 to prevent knight b4 and also block out the g7 bishop. And after rook d8, rook fd8, we play bishop g5, which forces f6. F6, bishop e3, putting more pressure. And after knight f5, we just activate the king with king f3. And there's one important move to know here is after bishop f8, there's actually sneaky threat here to take on e3. And let's just say after king e3, then there's going to be c4, opening up the square for the bishop, and that would give black a lot of compensation, or even give like a completely fine position. So here important is to prevent the move c4 by playing b3. And next we can just play king e2 next, and we can just enter a better endgame after we trade all of the rooks. And this structure is basically a free advantage for white because it's a 3-on-2 in the queen side, and this base b6 pawn is very weak. So this is a very nice endgame to enter. So instead of d5 here, bishop g7 is way more common, and here we just grab the center with e4. After d6 here, knowing that we might want to play c3 and d4 very soon, we don't need to play the move knight d2 immediately. We can play rook e1 first, and let's say after knight f6, c3, and once a castle. Now because the e4 pawn is under pressure, we need to defend it somehow, and so we play knight bd2, knight c6, and d4 here. And I think that after this exchange, white should be getting a very pleasant advantage. Rook c is the most common move, possibly threatening knight b4, and so we play a3 here. Knight a5 has been played a couple of times, and here the idea is possibly to trade with knight c4 to loosen white's control over the center, because this knight is defending e4. So here we just play d5. And this closes off the bishop, and we have ideas of playing like queen e2, play rook b1 to exit the long diagonal, and then the reason that we want to play rook b1 is to eventually push b4, and this knight is kind of awkward, so this gives white quite a pleasant advantage. So that essentially covers this double Fianchetto system. We can just play for the center with c3 d4 eventually. And yeah, After g3 here, actually black can play d5 and grab the whole center, play knight c6, try to go for e5, and we will actually cover that right now after the move d5 in this move order. So yeah, with d5 we see that the bishop is actually able to go out, so this provides some additional options for black. d5 is also the most principled move, just to grab the center. And after g3, there is a tricky move to know here, which is knight c6, and the idea is to threaten e5. And if we play a careless move like bishop g2, then we essentially enter a reverse Peert's defense after this one, and then like knight f6. This is essentially a Peert's defense, but just colors reversed. So I don't recommend doing that. Here's the exception where we play d4, and we just claim our stake in the center, and we just say that this knight is quite awkward on c6 as it does not allow the pawn to be pushed forward. And after bishop g4, which is the main line, and bishop g2, queen d7, the idea is just to long castle, and eventually some ideas of like bishop h3 to go for the attack, you know, h5, h4, stuff like that. But here after castles and long castles, after c3, it turns out that white's attack is really fast here. White can play b4 next, and then go for a very fast pawn storm. After bishop h3 and b4, white is just going to play a4, a5, play b5 to kick the knight back, possibly a6 even, or like b6. And with the knight kicked away from the c6 square, the knight can come to e5. So this is a very big advantage, almost decisive, you know, speaking long term. And so instead of that, knight c6, black can take their stake in the center with c5, and after bishop g2, knight c6, castles here is my recommendation. If we play a move like d4 here, I think this is like objectively the best move, but it doesn't enter system anymore, and you do need to know a lot of theory. The idea behind this is that if they take and go e4, then essentially we get a reverse Grunfeld defense, but we have the extra inclusion of bishop g2, which means that white has a slight advantage in this position. But I'm not going to be recommending that. I'm just going to be recommending castles, which is what Yasser recommended in his book, Winning Chess Openings. And now it gets very complicated. If they play a move like bishop g4, which has ideas of possibly taking the knight, here we have a very thematic move to strike in the center with d4. The idea is that we're sacrificing a pawn, but it's not really good to take it. Let's say after bishop f3, we still keep the bishop's eye open. If they take on d4 with the knight, then first off they get a tempo on the bishop, but we just simply retreat back. And we have ideas of playing c4, and if they take, obviously the b7 pawn is going to hang, and it's going to be like just a very bad position for black. And after e6 here, trying to defend the center, we play c4. And turns out we're just going to play knight c3, and black does not have a convenient way of defending the center. We can play a move like e3 or bishop e3, and the pressure is going to be too much. After knight f6, cd5, if they play ed5, then after knight c3, we play bishop e3 next, and the d5 pawn is just going to be weak. We're going to win it back with a monster bishop on this diagonal. And after knight takes d5, here we can play knight c3, and if they want to hold on to the pawn, they need to play knight c3. After bc3, knight c6, it looks like black is holding on to the pawn, but actually we have a decisive queen a4. The idea is obviously to take on c6, and also it allows the rooks to come into d1 and b1. And black's lack in development is just so pronounced, it's very difficult to defend. And I think the computer already assesses this as like +5. So after rook c8, rook b1, attacking b7, queen d7, rook d1, bishop d6. We have this really nice sacrifice with rook b7, takes on d6, and the c6 knight is going to fall next, giving white like a winning advantage. Let's say the castles, bishop c6, queen b1, we just retreat back with rook d1, and the bishop is defended and white is winning. So going back here, knight takes d4 doesn't work. Instead, c takes d4 is better, but here we have the nice move c4, opening up the board. And taking on c3 here doesn't work, because we can just take on d5, and let's say they take another pawn, then we can play bishop e2, and if they get a tempo on our bishop, we can just damage the pawn structure, play queen c2, and long term, our bishop is just going to be good, while this pawn is going to be weak. We're definitely going to win it back soon, and white just has a very pleasant advantage in this position. as the computer says. And instead if they play knight f6, then here we can play queen b3, exerting more pressure on the center. Now queen b6 has been tried a couple of times, which allows white to take on d5, which is not really which is why queen b6 is not a really good move. After cd5, queen b3, ab3, we don't really mind the doubling of pawns because this just opens up the a file and makes a7 a problem to defend. And so knight b4, here we can defend the pawn with rook a5. After b6, rook b5. This enters some complications, like let's say knight c2 is considered best, rook d1, rook c8, bishop f4, knight d7. And here I think best is to play d6 to give the rook some breathing room because there is possibly a threat of a3 here. It's possible to sacrifice the exchange with, sorry about that. It's possible here to sacrifice the exchange with knight a3, and you can check that in the BGN below. But I think d6 is best, just to stop black from getting any counterplay. And then after a6, bishop b7 is an important resource. And essentially after rook c5, takes, bishop c6, and then taking on e7, and then playing bishop c7. All of the queenside pawns are weak for black, and the pair of bishops really matter here. b5, bishop e6, knight e6, and then rook c1 here. And here, if they play a move like knight b4, then we can play bishop e7, and the a6 pawn is going to fall after we threaten the knight once more. And if they play d3 here, which gives breathing room to the knight, obviously we just, we can take here, but we can even go bishop e4, because if they take, then we win a piece. And after knight b4, we take e takes d3, and we just have an extra pawn in this position. We can even push it forward. The king is like better. It doesn't block the development of our own pieces like this, like the black king. And white is now up a pawn, so that's just just clearly winning. So that essentially covers this queen b3. If they play e6 to support the center, then we can just take on b7, knight e5, knight d2 is a nice move. Rook b8, queen takes a7, we don't really care. D takes c4, and here we have a nice tactic with knight c4. Because if they take on c4, then we have bishop c6, and then the knight has to block, then bishop takes d7 would be just crushing. The rook is hanging also. So here knight f3 is best, but after ef3, like you can see that black's development is lacking, white's pieces are so active, and in the end game, this is going to be like just completely winning with two connected pass pawns, while this pawn can be easily blockaded. So rook a8, queen b7, queen d5, forcing the exchange here, but we don't mind. We just gang up the pawn, bishop c5, a3, preparing b4, possibly bishop e2, and let's say f6, f4, preventing e5. So king d7, bishop d2, rook hc8, and then here rook ac1. This was played before in a game in 2017, and here the game continues something like this, where the king will march up the board, and after h6 here, cleanest was king e2, king d3, and then just like possibly playing rook b1 and pushing the pawns forward, something like this. And white's technically winning in this endgame with two connected pass pawns. So that gives me some confidence in this variation with playing c4 after knight f6 and then queen b3. Instead, if they take on c4, this is the main move. We can play knight d2 here, and the black center is really weak. It looks like they can support it with e5, but it becomes really loose after knight c4. We can have ideas of taking on c6 and all of those ideas. So black's position is very loose here, and we can see that white's development is just amazing. They have their two pieces out, they already castled, and after g6 here, preparing bishop g7 to support the center. We play knight c4, bishop g7, and then bishop f4 to prevent e5, because now we have bishop c6, intermezzo, and then we just take the pawn. So here, rook c8, queen b3 puts more pressure on black's position, and this is really bad for black, because after queen d7, rook ac1, knight f6 looks normal, but we have this nice move knight e5, which removes the knight from blocking this diagonal, and so the b7 pawn becomes weak. Let's just say they take, and if they play a move like b6 here, we're just winning after takes, and queen a4. We're going to take a7 next, and the structure is going to completely fall. White has the two bishops, d4 is also weak, so white wins. Instead, if they castle, we can just take on b7 here with an easy advantage. And yeah, white is gonna push these pawns all the way forward and just win. So that essentially covers yeah, this entire line. With bishop g4, we just play d4 and we just get a nice advantage. Instead, they can play e6 here. So yeah, we're gonna cover e5 just to gain us the entire center, and we're gonna enter reverse King's Indian. But they can also play e6 here, which is quite common. The idea is just to, just defend the center, and it's like, yeah, just get us. It's a slightly more passive position than e5, but it's obviously less confrontational, so it's more flexible. Black can kind of freestyle it. And here we just play d3, and essentially we achieve like a typical King's Indian attack setup with this kind of formation. But our bishop on c1 is a problem piece here, and in this, because this repertoire recommendation is going to be based on the double fianchetto, we are not going to be entering the mainline King's Indian attack with e4. I think that white isn't doing well in the mainline King's Indian attack. So after knight f6, here I recommend b3. And obviously if you play knight bd2 and you just play e4, then this is like mainline King's Indian attack stuff. Something like this, queen e2, a5, and yeah, it gets messy. But instead, I'm going to recommend b3 here. The idea is just to place the bishop on e2 and just control the e5 square. So if there's nothing wrong with this b3, with this double fianchetto setup, I'm going to choose it more often than not. After bishop e7, bishop e2, yeah, black will probably castle here. If they play a move like queen c7, then we can play e4. Very nice move. Noting that the g7 pawn is hanging at if they take twice. And if they castle, knight bd2, if they play d4 here, we're just going to play a4. And this system we're going to talk a bit later on, where we essentially prevent black from ever pushing b5 here. And so we want to put our knight on c4, move our knight away and play f4 with a decent game. And instead of queen c7, they can castle. And here I think it's very important to play the move knight e5. Most games just continue knight bd2 with e4 coming, but I don't think that this is the best plan. It's very important to play knight e5 to prepare taking on c6 here, before black can play queen c7. This is like a very strong continuation. After they notice that this move is very thematic, so if you see this in similar positions, you should definitely consider knight e5. After takes b6, black tries to solve the developmental problem with the bishop, and so here we just go back with the bishop because it might be risking itself on e5 to get stranded. And so here after bishop e7, knight d2, we just prepare e4 next. And after knight d7, e4, white is gonna prepare f4 next. And yeah, black does not want to take in the center because that will just activate our knight. So after bishop f6, yeah, black does manage to trade our dark sword bishop, which is very strong on this diagonal. But after takes, here I'm going to recommend two systems. Either we can play the move f4 here, which threatens the move e5 right now and gains space favorably. And after d takes e4, knight e4, queen e7, queen e2, white has a fine position here. I don't like the fact in general that we had to give up the dark sword bishop because it makes all of these dark sword weaknesses, but it's not something to be concerned about because black has no way to take advantage of it. So that's playable, but instead also a4 is possible to have some additional ideas of a5, as well as you can, like, white can still play f4 anyways in the future. So a5 tries to undermine the pawn chain, or yeah, this structure, and white can play queen e2, bring the other rook to e1 possibly, and then play f4 even. And this is a easy development scheme, so it's very playable. And instead of this e6 setup, we're gonna enter a lot of the theory after e5 here. And after d3, we actually just enter a reverse King's Indian, as I mentioned before. And after knight f6, we play e4. And black has three main options in this position. We'll go for the easiest one first, which is d4, which closes the center. And here we have a typical move. We play a4 to prepare knight a3 to c4, without allowing the pawn to push our knight back. And so after bishop e7, knight a3, castles, knight c4, Black can play queen c7 here, after which we can play knight h4, and we have ideas of like knight f5, and we don't mind like getting double pawns on the on f5 because that would open up our bishop, and we have ideas of like playing f4. So this gives white a nice position. Instead of they play knight d7 here, preparing some f6, also reinforcing the center. Here we can play knight e1 and preparing f4 ideas, and perhaps we can even push f5. This idea of like pushing f4 f5 is very typical in the King's Indian and the Mar del Plata variation, and this is good in this situation because the king has already castled. If the king hasn't castled, we will see actually a similar position where I don't recommend going into this plan with f4 f5. Let's say after knight b6, challenging the knight, we play b3 here, and if they ever take on c4, then their ideas of playing like c5 is just gone. So bishop e6, f4, f6, f5, bishop f7, g4, and this is a very typical King's Indian type of game, playing like h4, preparing g5 at some point. We can play like king h1 and rook g1 to support this plan, and this looks like a very pleasant position. You definitely need more experience in this type of structure to play it well, but I think that it's a very good situation. Bishop e7 here. Now, knowing that black hasn't castled here, playing a move like knight c3 would already be a mistake actually, because after d4 and knight e2, our rationale is eventually to go for knight d2 and f4, but knowing that the black king hasn't castled, this doesn't really work because they can play this move knight d7, and they're preparing f6 next, and also bring the knight to b6, playing for c5, bishop e6 and playing for c5, and after knight d2, knight b6, f4, black just plays f6 here. And the fact that black has not castled yet makes a world of difference, because this f4 plan with f5 only works if black has already castled and the king is under some pressure after this kind of stuff. But in this position, black doesn't need to do anything special. They just go for bishop e6 and play for c5. And so this is already a big advantage for black, which is why we need to take on d5 here to release the tension and also open up the e-file. After knight d5, rook e1, attacking the e5 pawn, f6 here. Simple is just we play c3 and we go for d4. Now, there are actually a bunch of moves possible in this position, and essentially against every single one of them, we will play d4. Sample line here's bishop g4. Okay, maybe bishop g4 I haven't covered, so I'll definitely include that in the PGN below. But let's say they play bishop e6, we play d4. Sample line is this, and then knight takes d4, making use of the fact that this bishop is hanging. And like, yeah, essentially we just get a lot of pressure on the center. We're not threatening to take right now because that would also help open up the f-file, after castles, that would open up the f-file. But something like this, yeah, seems to be fine for white. We can play bishop f4 here. And all of the lines here, at least most of the lines, either give white an equal position or give a slight advantage. So that is nice to know. And you can definitely check the BGN for yourself below. Some of the variations are more complicated than the others. Especially, I had trouble finding something against this bishop f5 move, because d4 is possible here, but it leads to some crazy complications. After takes and knight d to b4, threatening knight c2, knight c3, knight d4, and in this forcing line, queen f3, rook b8, yeah, and this rook d1 takes, queen d5. And essentially all of the lines here say that black should go for the draw, and white should also comply. Yeah, even this g4 move leaves nothing more than a draw with best play. Which is why in this, especially in this bishop f5 line, I recommend going for queen b3, which leads to an immediate draw. Like, unfortunately, after bishop e6, if we do something like queen d1, then besides repeating, black just gets like a nice development here, and yeah, so it's not really wise to do that. So we take on b7 here, and after this sequence, unfortunately the queen has nowhere to go but just like go for this repetition, because really, yeah, there's nothing better than that. But the point is that after queen b3 is that if they play a move like queen d7, then we have this knight e5 move, which gives white a pleasant advantage, I think. A slight advantage at that. But yeah, essentially against all of the moves except bishop f5, I recommend playing d4. Here, queen b3 is best, I think. So yeah, that's one of the other systems. And the last system here in the reverse King's Indian is the exchange variation. So after d4, black will play queen takes d1, rook takes d1, and here we have a very common tactic. Obviously, if they take on e4, then we have this typical knight takes e5 response, and this leads to a very good position for white. Critical here is knight takes f2, because if we take back, then black is actually just going to win a clean pawn. But here we have a typical tactic. We play bishop takes c6 with check, and after they take back, we take here, and we're just up a piece. So, you know, very typical King's Indian stuff. But after they play knight takes e5, bishop takes e4, bishop g4, yeah, we can play rook d5 here with a rook lift, knight f3, king g2, knight d4, knight c3 first, kicking the knight back, knight c6, and knight a3 here. And I think that white has a very good position. Materially, it's not better, but white has a lot of activity with knight b5 coming, or I think mainly the idea is bishop e3. So that's quite simple. And instead, bishop g4 is the main move. And here, theory in the King's Indian, like in the normal King's Indian, says that rook e1 is also a good move after knight d4 takes c3, and then bishop c5. This enters some really old theory, but I recommend playing c3 here, which is also quite a common move. And after knight takes e4, we play rook e1. And the thing is that they cannot take on f3 here, because after bishop takes f3, let's say they play knight f6, we just take on c6, damage the pawn structure, and white just has a winning endgame essentially. It's very decisive. It's near decisive in this kind of endgame. And any other move besides castling is not good. Let's just say knight f6, then again we take on e5, and then we take on b7 even. A nice intermezzo because I'm making use of this pin, winning a clean pawn. Instead of knight f6, f5 is possible, but knight h4 is very nice. And now there's, besides the threat of f3 right now, white is also threatening to play knight takes f5 and the bishop takes e4, just to win back the pawn, and leaving black with an isolated pawn in the center. So this is a very good position. And lastly is castling. The key point is that rook takes e4 would actually lose to rook d1, and then bishop takes f3, and then that would give black just a very nice position, just up a pawn, and with the bishop pair, I think. So here, best is I think knight e3, preparing knight c4 to attack the e5 pawn. And for the rest of the game, we're actually gonna have to play this position with just play based on compensation here, essentially, down a pawn. But I think the position is very good. After knight f6, since we can't take on e5 because of like the after exchange, rook d1 is still deadly, we play knight c4 here. And if they play a move like bishop e6, giving back the pawn but trying to just focus on development, getting the bishop out, for example, we take with the c knight, knight takes e5, knight e5, bishop d6, which threatens bishop e5 and rook d1. So we just retreat back with knight f3, rook he8, and b3, which just gets the pawn out of threat here, so we can freely develop this rook on a1. And after bishop f5, we just play bishop g5. We're not really threatening to take on f6, but just, being annoying and pitting the knight. Bishop e7, rook e5, bishop e6, and here bishop f6 is possible to win the pawn in c5, but clearly black gets a lot of compensation here. Even this one, there's a nice bishop takes c3 move, making use of the back rank stuff, which is a complete mess. So rook e1 here is simple, and white has a playable position that remains dynamically equal. It's very playable for both sides. Instead of bishop e6, more critical is knight d7, defending the pawn. And here we're just going to play knight g5, threatening f7. And there's only one good way to defend it, which is bishop h5. So after bishop h5, defending the pawn, we can play bishop d5, threatening the pawn again. And this forces f6. After that, we jump with the knight in, knight e6, rook e8. And here we just focus on development, play bishop e3. And if bishop f7 happens, then we can just take on c8. And if king b8, a very logical, just getting the king to a safer place. a4 is very nice, preventing any b5 pushes. And we can also consider playing a move like a5. After bishop f7, white has to do something. And so we take on f8. And they have to take with the e rook, because if they take with the other rook, then then they just lose an exchange after knight d6. So they take out the e-rook, and then we just trade the bishops, play a5, which is a very nice move. And now this fixes this pawn structure on the queen side. And the problem for black is that if they ever play like a b5 and then we take en passant, then there's going to be another weakness, which is the base of their pawn chain. And in this position, because we can quickly play rook ad1, and we can even double up on the d file, white has very good compensation here for the pawn. And the important thing to know is that this knight is stuck to defending the c5 pawn, meaning that for the meantime, black cannot challenge white's control over the d file, and the computer even assesses this position as slightly better for white. So yeah, black's position is kind of stuck, so yeah, the pawn doesn't really matter. We can activate the king as well. So that's essentially this this exchange variation. Very critical, I think. And so that's the setups with where black plays d5 and c5. So we covered all of that. We will also cover knight f6 here. After bishop g2, there are options of black to play bishop f5 or bishop g4. So if they play bishop g4 here, the idea is to to take on f3 to reduce white's control over the center. So here playing d4 is possible, very much so, but I just recommend castling. And the main idea is bishop f3, right? And here bishop f3 would give, I think, white quite a nice edge. ef3 is more of a system-based approach because you can just play like this normal development scheme with d3, knight d2, f4, knight f3, and then control the e5 square. So for example, e6, f4, playing d3, bring the knight to f3, rook e1, knight e5, b3, bishop e2, with a slight advantage. But objectively best here is to take with the bishop, and they cannot support the center with e5 here because we just undermine it, and their lack of development just is accentuated by our playing the c4 move. For example, they can't take here because the rook just drops, and if they play c6, then after d4 we force black to push the pawn forward, and after pushes bishop g2, bishop e7, knight c3, white actually has a big advantage here because white will play queen b3 to exert more pressure on b7 and d5, play bishop f4, e3, and then this pressure on black's center, which isn't alleviated immediately, is very difficult to deal with. We don't want to play cd5 quickly because that would give the knight the c6 square, so that's an important note. Black just has a lot of weak points there. So here, for example, e6, d4, we just put a pawn in the center, bishop e7, knight d2, c4, and so this is another system where we actually put the pawn to d4 and c4, because they cannot take because the b7 pawn hangs again. And so after c6, e4 here, we note that in this position it just resembles a closed Catalan, and I really like the closed Catalan position for white. The problem is that in the mainline Catalan we cannot force black to enter the closed Catalan unless they also oblige. So here e4 is a really nice move, possibly threatening e5, and also after d4, knight e4 takes. White just has an easy development scheme, playing bishop e3 to defend the center, play queen c2 with the tempo on h7, and then play on the queen side here as well, like play a3 b4 or like rook b1 b4 b5, that's sort of idea. So that's a very nice position for white. Instead, if they go for this bishop f5, this is like a reverse London system essentially. The bishop is quite good right now on this diagonal, but after we play the move d3, like after castles e6 and d3, this bishop is actually quite vulnerable to getting hit with a move like e4. And here we can also execute our double Fianchetto setup without any issues. So after knight h6, knight bd2, bishop e7, b3, we just go for the double Fianchetto here. After castles, bishop e2, knight bd7. Here it's possible to play the move rook e1 to prepare e4, but I actually prefer the move queen e1, which is I think the second most common move. The idea is that the queen prepares the push of e4, and we don't need our f rook on e1. We rather want our a rook on e1 so that in the future we can push f4. So this I think gives white something to play for, a very easy plan, So that's what we're looking for in a system opening. Something simple. We know the strategy and the position without taking too much risk, hopefully. So yeah, essentially against the London system, reverse London system, that's what I can recommend. And that's against this d5 move. So yeah, knight f6. Yeah, so we covered everything there. And instead, if they play knight f6, typical, King's Indian players will go for this. They want to play g6, bishop g7, or even like, Grinfeld players. After g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, they kind of copy our system. But, this is very common in the King's Indian. Castles, and here b3. I think that if we don't play b3 now, it's going to be quite difficult to get in the future. So I think b3 here is a reasonable option. And with this a5 move, I just want to mention that there is quite a thematic idea to know whenever black tries to push a5, a4 quickly. We just after bishop b2, and if they push a4, we have this move b4 to gain some space. We can consider a3 next, even consider like putting the pawns on the center, d3, and then just getting this kind of space advantage on the queen side. And it's important that the knight is still on b1 to defend the a3 square, so that the a3 push is not possible. After d5 here, we just play a3, knight bd7, d3, rook e8, and then here, as I mentioned, we play c4, and we have a nice space advantage on the queen side here. After e5, we can take on d5 and then just play queen c2. And this setup with queen c2, play knight bd2, bring the rooks to the c file and d file, put pressure. We can eventually go for like a central break with e3, d4 as well. This is a very easy system to memorize or to understand. The queen first off just defends the bishop, and so there are no possible e4 threats with some double attack business. So this is quite a nice position and easy to know. So that's against a5. Against d5 here, we just which puts more pressure on the center. We just play bishop e2. Against c5, we just play d3 here, and we have our typical double fianchetto setup. Knight c6, and again we have this knight e5 move, which is important to prevent black from playing queen c7 and then e5 themselves. And so here, that this is a very thematic move. Queen c7, and then we take on c6, and then play c4 here, making use of this pin, and just making the bishop stronger here. E6, and then e4 here is very nice. They can't take twice here, but that would like walk right into a pin. Oops. With queen e2 and like a very unpleasant pin on the queen. So rook d8 is recommended, but after queen e2, we support the center, b6, knight c3 puts more pressure, and yeah, white is just having a very, very, very nice, solid advantage here. We can even change the pawn structure to make it favorable, or we can maintain the tension in the center. So yeah, more calculation definitely is needed, but you should do that yourself over the board. Instead of d5 here, which puts a pawn at the center, they can also go for d6, which is more common maybe of like King's Indian players. They just want to play knight f6, g6, bishop g7, castles, go for d6 against anything. And so here, it's possible to play d4, but I just recommend playing bishop e2, and for e5, grab some space with c4 to control the d5 square. And after rook e8, defending the center, black's idea is possibly to go in the future with c6, d5, and so we will be very careful to control that. And here we just play d3, and we have this nice, this nice triangle here, where e4 is not really a favorable push because we would trade off the bishops, and black's dark thread bishop is something that they want to keep. And so this is a very nice position. We can play like queen c2, knight bd2, if the knight comes to c6, we can play a3 to prevent knight b4, and let's just say they play c6 here, preparing d5, knight bd2, and white is just going to play, as I said before, queen c2, bring the rooks to c file, to the c file and d file, knight bd7, queen c2, a5, threatening to play a4, and here we can play a3. The point is that if they play a4, we can obviously just push b4, and this pawn may be a weakness in the future. After d5, we can even gain more space with c5. And yeah, I mean, d5 looks very logical here, but we play c5. And after we play the move e4, if they ever push or do something with the pawn, then we can get the c4 square for the knight, which would look at all of the holes in black's position. So white can also play rook ac1 and rook fe1, so this is a very pleasant advantage for white. Instead, if they play queen e7 here, which is just a useful move developing, rook fe1, let's just say they play d5, we can take on d5 and then play e4. And again, if they push here, we want to place our knight on c4, but it's going to get hit with b5. So important here is to play a4. And after that, we get the c4 square for the knight. We can even move our bishop from its bad diagonal now, which is closed off, to to play bishop a3. And white has a pleasant position. And instead of that, if they don't go for c6 here, they can also go for knight c6, just, you know, developing. And we play knight c3 here, because like c6, d5. Okay, yeah, just in general, knight c6 here, we can just control the center further. I'm not gonna go into specific lines here, but we just add a support over the center. Yeah, a5 here, and again we play a3. A3 is just a generally useful move, even if they don't play a5, because we want to play queen c2 without getting hit with knight b4. And yeah, white will just simply play queen c2, rook ac1, rook fe1, which is important, and then yeah, can just play the position from there. Important here is just like to make sure that the e4 push doesn't really work for black. So for example, if they play bishop f5, queen c2 would already run into some problems after e4, and the queen is quite vulnerable here. So that is something that we want to avoid. And yeah, we can even consider closing the center with e4, or we can even keep more flexible with playing a move like knight d2, you know, or even e3. So yeah, essentially that's my recommendation to like cut down on a lot of theory. What you need to know is that with this system opening, it's very possible that you will get surprised because they don't play something according to anything explained in this video. But with these common ideas, themes, and, you know, your knowledge of these kind of Fianchetto systems or 1d4 openings, you can very likely transpose into something that you're very comfortable with. For example, if you can even easily transpose into close Catalan if black plays some sort of passive d5, c6, and e6 structure. And it's, yeah, personally, I really like those kind of positions for white. So yeah, and against, like, for example, Queen's Indian, again, you can enter the mainline stuff if you're very well prepared and, you know, very knowledgeable in the Queen's Indian for white. So yeah, that wraps up this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Yeah, I've also, as a last note, I've tried this to play the system in Blitz, and more than a couple of times have I been like surprised at my opponent's choices, so beware of that. But I do think that the system is very much playable and something you can have in your back pocket as a secondary weapon if you're tired of playing your normal openings or you're tired of theory. So that's going to be it from me. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for 500 subscribers, so that's a big milestone. And yeah, if you have any you know, suggestions for future videos, then do comment those below. That's going to be it for me. Thank you so much for watching. Everyone, please stay safe and have fun playing chess. Bye bye.